everyone to today's Connect and Learn on Connecticut's housing crisis, being co-sponsored by Social Venture Partners and the Asset Funders Network. We are delighted today to have two experts who are working to address Connecticut's housing crisis. Christie Stewart. I hear some background, so please mute yourself if you can. We're delighted to have two experts who are working to address Connecticut's housing crisis. Christie Stewart, the Chief Initiative Officer for the Center of Housing Opportunity at the Connecticut Housing Collaborative, and Peter Harrison, the Director of Desegregate CT. We believe that to address the racial wealth gap and educational opportunity gaps, you need to address housing affordability and segregation, because housing lies at the center of many of the challenges faced by people in our state. We'll have the opportunity today to learn a lot more about the housing situation and how it affects our goals of expanding opportunities. Today's session is the January installment of our monthly Connect and Learn series, organized by SVP on key topics of interest in addressing opportunity gaps and the racial wealth gap in our state. These sessions occur on the second Tuesday of every month. I want to give a special shout out to Martha Mincer for the excellent job that she's done leading our Connect and Learns over the past year. She'll be passing the baton to some other people at SVP, but we're happy to advertise that this series will be ongoing. Our February 14th session will focus on the proposed legislation to address educational funding equity in our state and feature SVP's board chair, Jamila Prince Stewart, the ED of Faith Acts for Education. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Christie is, as I said, is the Chief Initiative Officer for the Center for Housing Opportunity. It's a Connecticut-based nonprofit working to end homelessness and ensure equitable access to safe and affordable housing. Christie served over 15 years on various leadership teams in the housing and homelessness sectors, designing and implementing strategies and collaborative partnerships to drive social impact. In her current role, Christie leads the affordable housing practice for the Housing Collective, overseeing collective impact teams in several parts of the state, Fairfield County, Litchfield County, and Eastern Connecticut, that are dedicated to creating regional responses to housing affordability challenges. She's partnered with the Urban Institute to co-author the first comprehensive landscape analysis of housing in Connecticut, commissioned by the state's Department of Housing. She co-authored The Way Forward, a new narrative for housing in Fairfield County, with leading national sociologist Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and she facilitated Governor Lamont's housing policy transition team. Peter Harrison is the director of Desegregate CT. He has over a decade of experience in housing policy and tenant organizing. Previously, he was senior housing policy advisor for Data for Progress, a progressive think tank, where he co-authored the Homes for All report and advised on the presidential campaigns of several presidential candidates. He previously researched housing and climate policy at the Buell Center at Columbia University. We're going to take Q&A after each speaker speaks. So you should feel free to either put your questions as they occur in the chat line and or raise your hand, and we'll recognize you after each of the speakers. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Christie Stewart, and look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk to everyone today. One part of my resume that Mark didn't mention is I was a member of SVP for a few years, so it's a fabulous organization. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you and share some of the work that I do with colleagues like Pete. So I'm going to ask you to forgive me, but I am going to use a slide deck, which is not terribly exciting or original, but will help, I think, walk us through what is often somewhat dense information. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Okay. Pete, can you see that? All good? Okay. So again, my name is Christie Stewart. I am the Chief Initiative Officer for something we call the Center for Housing Opportunity. It is an initiative of an organization called the Housing Collective. And just a brief overview of the Housing Collective. We are what we call a collective impact organization. We provide the backbone support, if you will, for many organizations who are working to end homelessness and ensure stable, affordable housing is available for all. The Center for Housing Opportunity is one of 3 of the Housing Collective's key initiatives, and it's the area of work that I lead. And what I thought we would do today is this is sort of an overview of what I'm hoping to cover, and then I will pass the baton to Pete. But I want to get into sort of what the current affordable housing gap is in Connecticut to give you all a little bit of a baseline, what the impact of that gap is, how we ended up in this situation, and then hopefully some of the things that Pete and myself and some of our colleagues think that we can do to address it. So the simple math is that Connecticut is short 86,000 units of housing that would be affordable to those making between 0 and 30% of our area median income. And I know that's a little bit wonky, but we and every other housing group across the country uses the same methodology, which is American Community Survey data. And basically, we measure the number of households that need housing in certain cost bands. And then we measure the number of housing units that exist with rents in those cost bands. And the differential is what we call the housing gap. This slide comes from the study that I did with the Urban Institute. And what I think is interesting is that the gap in housing units in Connecticut exists at the low end of the cost band. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle in our state, because when we build and preserve housing at higher cost bands, so maybe there's housing that's considered affordable because it's at 80% of area median income, that is not actually addressing the gap that we see in the units that we need. So that's something that we all think a lot about in the housing space and are really pushing our policymakers to focus on, which is not just building housing that is affordable, but building housing that is affordable, that fills the gap that the state actually has. And just by way of context, in case it's interesting, these, again, are not individuals. We're measuring households with this data. And if you're wondering what area median income looks like, so in Connecticut, a family of 4, 100% AMI is about $127,000 a year. And for a single person, it's about $66,000 a year. And what we learned when we really dug in to the data behind this slide is that clearly our policies and the units that we're producing are not doing anything to shrink this 86,000 gap. And we're going to talk a minute about why that's important and how we ended up there. So that gap in housing, even if it doesn't impact you or your neighbors, it in an obvious way in terms of your housing choices, it absolutely impacts all areas of Connecticut, particularly economic growth, health outcomes, education outcomes, and economic mobility. As data, continues to show, housing is foundational. And if you speak to, for example, the hospital systems in Connecticut right now, they will tell you they have a serious shortage of workers because they can't, one of the reasons is that they can't find housing to support the workforce that they need. And it's a serious issue. It's the reason that we sit down and work with them often, which is they're recognizing how important workforce housing is to their ability to run their hospital systems. Economic mobility is incredibly impacted by housing. As you can imagine, if you're housing insecure and you spend all of your time and worrying about housing and trying to move from town to town to be able to afford rent as things are gentrified in Connecticut, don't have a lot of time for working on your career. I know this is a lot of the work that Mark does in terms of career pathways and economic mobility. And it's the housing market and economic mobility are inextricably linked. I'd be happy to share myriad wonky data reports with you that I find fascinating that get into that. Economic growth is also an issue. Something I sort of can't believe every time I read it is that researchers estimate that the growth in gross domestic product between 1964 and 2009 would have been 13.5% higher if families had better access to affordable housing. And this would have led to $1.7 trillion increase in income over that time period. So we're in this age of big data. We're excited to see some research like this start to percolate because we think it is going to help elevate housing as an issue that those interested in economic progress are also focused on. So the obvious question to me as we look at an 86,000 unit housing gap is, how did this happen? How did we get here? And there are a couple of answers to that question. Big picture, our federal government in the 80s sort of migrated all of our housing policy to this really cool thing called low-income housing tax credits. So they sort of got out of the business of building what they call social housing. So remember, this is sort of all happening when projects like Cabrini Green are being taken down in Chicago. We've moved as a country toward this policy of low-income housing tax credits as being the largest driver of housing production. And the thing about low-income housing tax credits is that the properties that are built, the units that are built, their deed restrictions, so the restrictions that keep them affordable, expire. And when the policy was first enacted and we started doing this, they usually expired between 40 to 60 years. So we've hit with 2020 the leading edge of expiry for thousands and thousands of units across the country and obviously in Connecticut. And the reason this is important is that even if we stopped today and didn't build a single new unit of housing in Connecticut, the gap would continue to grow because units that are deed restricted through low-income housing tax credit programs, those deed restrictions are expiring and they are reverting to private market. And so again, that's just something that we all keep an eye on in the housing sector because we focus a lot on production, but bigger bang for your buck in terms of addressing this is actually preservation of deed restricted units. So that's sort of a federal policy change that really started the underproduction of housing. And just to put a little meat on those bones, in real dollars, federal spending on housing and community development increased $42 billion from 1977 to 2019, whereas public welfare spending, so everything else, increased about $600 billion. So there's just a discrepancy and a not as big a prioritization from the federal government on housing. Some things that are unique to Connecticut that are important as we look at all of this are, first and foremost, right now, Connecticut and Fairfield County in particular has the lowest vacancy rate in the country at just below 2%. Couple that with the fact it's about the 6th most expensive housing market in the country. And It just has put tremendous pressure on the low end of the housing market, and affordable units are just almost impossible to find right now. That's playing out in interesting ways, but the key one, and the one I would imagine you'll all start seeing on the streets, is that for the first time in 7 or 8 years, our homeless numbers are rising. We have families who have housing vouchers, but can't use those vouchers in the private market because there just aren't units. So that's a big deal. Connecticut also has one of the most significant levels of racial residential segregation, which plays into this and is borne out by lots of data and research, particularly out of Brown University. And then we have the compounding problem of we have no county government here. And so we have 169 towns who've been charged with addressing their affordable housing needs. And I'm not a Connecticut native, so I can say this, but it's a crazy way to address a problem like this, especially given the nature of the way we all live in Connecticut, which is, I lived in Weston for 10 years. My doctors were in Norwalk and Wilton and Westport. It's not like we live inside the boundaries of our towns. So having no county government is incredibly challenging when it comes to tackling issues like housing affordability. Housing is a regional issue. And then the other sort of big challenge is that our state does not do a very good job of coordinating across agencies when it comes to issues of housing. It also has been made pretty clear, if you just read the state budget, that housing and housing affordability is not a priority of this administration. The sort of that, so lack of meaningful investment in it, coupled with a lack of coordination across agencies in Hartford, is compounding some of the issues that we're seeing and making it doubly hard to address this unit shortage. Keep going. So if you take all of that, Pete and I spend an inordinate amount of time wondering, okay, so what do we do? We have to move forward and we have to do better. The Center for Housing Opportunity is very clear that we feel there needs to be, losing my place. That these 3 pieces are part of the solution that we have to bring to the table. So one is a coordinated, proactive investment strategy for housing in the state. And what we mean by that is currently, if you look at housing development, it's driven by opportunity. So a developer will have a project that they're excited about. They'll bring it to the state for funding, and the state will decide if it's a project it wants to fund. Our point is the state should use the data that it now has to be proactive in determining where and how to make the highest and best use of the funds it has to spend on housing. So instead of being driven by developer opportunity, the state should say, we've looked at the data. This is where we know we need housing. We need it at this level of affordability. These are the projects we want. And be much more strategic in funding. We also feel very strongly that housing affordability will require regional planning. You may or may not have heard that in June, each of the 169 municipalities in town or in the state submitted for the first time affordable housing plans, which is a great baby step toward part of the solution. But housing is a regional issue, and we would like to see the state move toward regional planning for housing. And then resource prioritization based on need, which is what I talked about a little bit a minute ago, which is really looking at the data and what it's telling us in terms of what parts geographically of the state, what cities, what jurisdictions need housing at what affordability level the most. and prioritizing state resources in those areas. So I won't linger on this slide, but this is just making the point that we cannot build our way out of this. This is not, you just can't produce 90,000 units of affordable housing with the kind of investment that we currently have. We need to preserve. And even in its best case scenario of reading of the data, the net annual change in affordable housing supply between 20 and 21 was an increase of 2,998 units. And when we're losing thousands of units a year to deed restriction, you can see we're not going to make progress against this $86,000 number. This is just an interesting example of how we suggest the state take a look at prioritizing some of its resources. We worked to identify the 10 towns in the state of Connecticut that are most housing have the most number of housing cost burden renters, so have the greatest shortage of units at that 0 to 30% AMI level. And this is a great way for policymakers to start thinking about prioritization based on need. This is where we segue into some of what Pete is going to talk about, but there are policy recommendations that come out of this work, and we broadly put them into these 4 buckets. So production, and this includes things like transit-oriented development, regional affordable housing planning, cross-agency coordination, preservation, which I've mentioned. There are things we can do. There are national best practices we could bring to Connecticut, including regional preservation networks. And again, better cross-agency coordination so that when we have the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy and Environment, Department of Mental Health Services, and the Department of Economic and Community Development all earmarking dollars for housing, we need those dollars and those programs to be coordinated much more effectively. And then just the last one is documenting and monitoring. As Mark mentioned, our study was the first ever compilation of a full inventory of all of affordable housing across the state. Which is shocking. The state needs to be investing both time and resources in doing a much better job of documenting what housing it has, monitoring it, and setting targets for how setting targets for preservation and production to move us out of that. So I know that it was a lot of info to dump all at once, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I hope this dovetails nicely. Pete is going to be talking about very specific policy work that he's doing to address some of these. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Christie, maybe I'll start with the question, which is, given this 86,000 unit shortage for the 0 to 30% average median income, or the median income, how much production is actually happening right now? Number one. Number two, does the state have any goals at all with regard to production of housing units such as this? And third, have the qualified opportunity zones or opportunity zone federal legislation, is it having any impact at all in Connecticut, for affordable housing?
Right. Those are great. Those are all really great questions. I may take them in reverse order. I can tell the opportunity zones are problematic for the production of housing at the low area median income, because what it comes down to is there's no exit strategy for investors in that low end of the market. And so we've found they've had almost no impact in Connecticut. And the 1 or 2 projects I can think of that used or utilized opportunity zone policies, the only units they produced that could qualify were between 80 and 100% area median income. And if you do the math, it makes sense. It's right. That's just not a policy that's going to spur production at the low end of the area median income housing market. With regard to targets, I dream about the day the state sets housing targets. They have not set them. That is absolutely something I think everyone should be pushing for. Without targets, there is no accountability. I think it's inexcusable that we don't have housing targets, particularly at for those Connecticut residents, at the 0 to 30, 0 to 50% area median income level. That is the purpose of the Department of Housing, is to provide for those vulnerable populations that fall into that category. And then number of units, it depends on who you ask. But we do know between, again, the year between 20 and 21, around 3,000 units came online, and there's a lot in there to unpack, but if you, depending on the data that you're looking at, that number can drop as low as 200, but let's give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say, we're producing around 2,900 units a year. Hopefully that will increase. It's a trailing indicator, so we can never tell until the year has passed, but that's kind of where we are.
So that's a long process.
Mm-hmm. Very.
30 years by my accounting, based on the math, assuming that you retain all the existing units.
Which won't happen. Yeah. It's a long and expensive process. Yeah.
Questions from the participants? Either you can put it in the chat line or just raise your hand. Looks like, Christie, you've just done such a fabulous job.
I just bored everyone to tears. I know it's wonky, but let's see.
Here is a question.
Can you speak to how you are building political will to change things? Sure. So a couple of things going on with regard to that. Public will building is we think, one of the key solutions that we have to bring to the table. And we have been working for the last few years on something that we call narrative change. We've been working, as Mark mentioned, with a sociologist named Dr. Tiffany Manuel. We published a sort of guidebook, if you will. Literally, what did we do? We took about 3 months and did a massive research project funded by Melville Charitable Trust, where we focus grouped hundreds of residents in Fairfield County and learned what it was that could be messaged to them that would not necessarily change anyone's minds, but would activate interest in this issue among people who maybe just don't think about this. And from that research distilled and then put out into the world this narrative change playbook, which is very specific instruction on how to discuss this issue. And it's things like, don't start by saying the sky is falling, we're 86,000 units short. So I just did exactly what I'm not supposed to do when I presented this to you. And I'm happy to put a link in the chat to that playbook. But we really think that narrative change, we need to change the way we think about housing affordability, even just saying housing affordability instead of affordable housing. These are things where sociologists have been able to measure the impact those kinds of things have. And without that public will and support for housing for everybody, it's going to be very hard to move policy. So thank you, Karen, for that question. And Karen, by the way, is doing an amazing job with Grow Together Connecticut, which is also working on something similar, changing the narrative. Sorry, Dorothy, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks. It's perhaps a somewhat specific question. I'm on the board of Capital for Change, the statewide CDFI funding affordable housing. And one of the challenges that we are also challenged to try to become proactive. It's rather difficult because we rely on not only developers, but then the whole property management sequence that happens afterward.
Mhm.
And I'd be curious to hear from both you and then later from Pete what some of the steps could be to help get more on that front, because I get the feeling that we're ready to fund and lend to it, and even if it's not the prettiest picture, but that perhaps the development may be okay, but the property management side is really, really, really tough. And so, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll be really brief because I want to get to, I love Pete's presentation. I want to get to that, and then we can pick this up. But Dorothy, part of my thinking on this is twofold. The property management side is incredibly challenging. And if you spend time like I do talking to a lot of the nonprofits that manage these properties, they're not funded properly. Right. And even though an organization is a nonprofit, that doesn't mean it's not an ongoing business concern and shouldn't be run in the same way any other business would be run. And the state, CHAFA, not to throw CHAFA under the bus, but in particular has decreased all of its funding over the last decades that used to support, co-op members, for example. All that funding has just disappeared. And so you have nonprofits who have developed these units and want to manage them well and properly, but they don't have the funding. They don't have the funding to do it. That's a very short and simplified answer, but Mark, sorry.
Yeah, maybe we could just kind of answer a few of these questions fairly
Sure.
quickly.
Sure.
And maybe I can group them together. Looks like Trevor's asking, are there a couple of questions? Where's the problem most acute in the state? And are there any specific public-private initiatives to deal with the issue?
Sure. It's absolutely most acute in Fairfield County. As you know, we have what we call 4 urban centers in Fairfield County. So it's no surprise that it's acute there, but it's also part of the Metro New York region. And the property value is so high in Fairfield County that it makes penciling out the math on an affordable development without deep subsidy virtually impossible. And to quantify that, what I mean is, if you need a subsidy, it's going to cost around $500,000 to build a single unit of subsidized housing in Fairfield County. That's just extraordinarily expensive. And when you look at the land costs, it's very difficult to produce those units. And so we need investment from the state and the government, because the private market is never going to do that on its own. They can pick up the units at the 80% AMI, and they do really well in cities like Stanford. But when you talk about 0 to 50% area median income units, no private entity is going to be able to do that without deep public subsidy.
And there's also a question in here, which I think kind of your presentation talked about, are there specific or unique circumstances about Connecticut that makes the housing challenge harder? I don't know if you had any other comments.
Yeah, we just talked about one, which is, especially in southeastern Connecticut, the cost of land is exorbitant. The county government, no county government is very challenging. We have 169 towns. If you take out the cities where they have paid planning staff that are very talented and very good at their job, we have hundreds, over 100 towns where some of them don't have planning departments. Some of their staff is volunteer. We don't have the capacity and the technical expertise on the ground, quite frankly, in 169 towns to really manage this issue. We also, in Connecticut, we're doing better, but don't at a state level have the data and the ability to analyze and use that data to make policy choices. I think that DOH's investment in the study that we did with Urban Institute is a great step forward, but a considerable amount of resources should be put towards data, in my estimation, so that the state can overcome some of its governance challenges.
Christie, that's really super helpful. Let's shift now to Pete. And Pete, can you give us your presentation?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Christie, for setting this up. It's I don't think you contradicted the case making about bringing up the need. I mean, this is the audience that's already activated and wants to hear this stuff. So I think that was appropriate, and hopefully I can add on a little bit of the conversation about at least part of the solution to some of these issues. I apologize. There's a scary fan that went on behind me that I'm usually not in my wife's loft, but she's not feeling well. So can people hear me okay? I'm seeing thumbs up. Okay, great. Well, yes, thank you for everybody for hosting me. I haven't had a chance to speak here before, so really was appreciative of the invitation. And I will talk a little bit about the work that Desegregate Connecticut does, broadly speaking, but I did want to specifically talk about the proposal that we're introducing this coming legislative session in the next couple of days, actually, called Work, Live, Ride. So that'll be most of what I talk about. I'll try to get through everything kind of quickly. But my name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut. Originally from Avon, Connecticut, was down in New York City for just about 2 decades and just recently moved back with my wife and baby. And I'm struggling finding a place. You certainly could not stay in Manhattan with a baby and have space, but growing up in Avon, there aren't starter homes. There aren't really, frankly, a lot of apartments. So to be close to my parents, we were able to at least find this place in Simsbury that is building some apartments and multifamily housing, but there's really, particularly at the low end of the AMI levels, as Christie talked about, but we're seeing this across economic bands in Connecticut. And in some cases, that makes it harder to get funding for low AMI housing in sort of a zero-sum approach on the budget. In others, it makes it easier because there's a wider spectrum of folks at different racial backgrounds, geographic locations, economic standpoints that are being impacted by the housing crisis in Connecticut today that maybe weren't, a few years ago. And that's an opportunity to expand the coalition. To Karen's great question about how do we have the political will to do something for everybody. And I think, unfortunately, the nature of the crisis being so expansive does present that opportunity, and certainly groups like ours and others are working together with other activists and legislators to get stuff done. So just a little bit about Desegregate Connecticut. We are a pro-homes coalition of just about 80 nonprofit and neighborhood groups. We are fundamentally a group that believes that better zoning laws at the local, state level can lead to a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable Connecticut. We are part of the Regional Plan Association, which is a 100-year-old advocacy organization started in Connecticut, New York, and it's been part of the tri-state area for 100 years. I'll make a plug at the end of this. Actually, there's a really neat presentation that we're doing, kind of a roadshow of the 100-year anniversary and some local stuff in Connecticut specifically. But we are a group that expands large nonprofits and affordable housing groups like Christie's group, all the way down to environmental groups, to legal groups, to anti-racism groups, to neighborhood groups, folks that were particularly activated during the summer of 2020 after the George Floyd murder and a lot of the racial uprisings and conversations that started really across the state and across the country, really fed into the growth of our organization and really gave us the opportunity to make some of these connections between the end result of housing either not being available or being very expensive to the land use policies that we make across these 169 communities, as Christie has talked about, and the legacy of many of these decisions over time compounding to see Connecticut in a really economically and racially segregated place, even uniquely amongst other states in Connecticut. So we talk about ourselves being a pro-homes coalition. What do we mean by that? We really think of a home certainly as a physical shelter you might own or rent, but it is also a place, a community of ideas, opportunities, and connections. And it is also a sense of place, physical place that has a past, a present, and a future. So when we talk about being pro-homes, we're not just talking about housing units or land use. We're talking about this broader sense of community and trying to find the unique local circumstances where we can improve that, and at the regional level and the state level where we can improve that. Very specifically, we believe that creating abundant, diverse homes and communities, we have this holy trinity of issues where we talk about land use reform in the context, as I mentioned, of shared economic prosperity, racial inclusivity, and particularly environmental sustainability. All three of these issues really interact with each other. We think this does give us an opportunity to get folks at different places and different political ideologies where maybe, as many people have seen in Connecticut, the conversation about racial segregation can make people uncomfortable, but maybe the economic argument lands a little bit better, or maybe the environmental sustainability of getting out of car-centric sprawl lands a little bit. So we have really invested a lot in terms of our research that we do, the education that we do, and the advocacy that we do to make this as big of a tent as possible, because this does impact everybody across the political spectrum. With that said, we take specifically what we call an all of the above approach. And Christie talked about this too in one of her slides of, what do we do? How do we fix all of this? And this all of the above approach is kind of our catch-all term for this. But number one, it means building more kinds of homes that could be publicly owned homes, privately owned homes, public-private partnerships. It's duplexes, it's apartments, it's community land trust, somebody mentioned. Everything that can possibly be done in Connecticut or to build a home should be done. And we certainly want to center and elevate home renters, being one myself, but we want to give more opportunities for people at different ages, different opportunity levels, and different parts of the state, an opportunity to find a place. And that just involves every possible solution that we can get. It also means acting at every level of government. As Christie's talked about, the most frustrating thing about Connecticut is we just really do not plan regionally, even though we do sort of by default. So the idea of activating pro-homes activists and policy ideas at the local level is really where we start. But we also want to encourage regional cooperation across the state, and also state level action, where we do think the state has a really important role to play in encouraging good local behavior, and in some cases preventing bad local behavior. And increasingly, as Christie also mentioned, we are trying to get the federal government to recognize that this is a critical national security issue for economic prosperity, for the climate crisis. The federal government has done an immense amount to subsidize a certain kind of housing for a certain kind of person at a certain time and place, but it has not done that elsewhere, and we really need to do that as well. So although we talk about all the above approach, today I'm going to be talking about what we're probably better known for, which is the state level approach, which I'll get into in a second. And then finally, this all the above approach means working in and with diverse coalitions. We really, our lane is land use reform in the housing space, and we think that's a really important place. There's a need for that kind of leadership in Connecticut, but we work very closely with housing groups to learn and to support their efforts, whether it's good cause eviction, right to counsel, or otherwise. We work with environmental groups to try to coordinate those activities, to try to bring in different groups so we can educate them on how their issues are impacted by land use, and vice versa, is how we can improve how we think about these issues and how we can get things done and build power to actually pass things that we know will meaningfully change the benefit of our communities. And just very broadly speaking, we are a data-driven organization, so I'd be remiss not to mention our zoning atlas, which was the first of its kind, which, Christie's talked about this. The state does not do a lot of this kind of work, but really when we started Desegregate Connecticut, one of the first projects we put together was putting together 2,200 different zoning jurisdictions across the 169 cities and towns, actually map out visually what are we talking about with zoning policies and why are they leading to economic and racial segregation. And this is just to very quickly contrast view. This zoning atlas is on our website. I encourage folks to check it out in more detail. A lot of our research briefs comes from data that we've mined from this resource. But a lot of the problem, not the only problem, but a lot of the problem of the housing crisis in Connecticut is the fact that we really exclusively allow single family homes on large lots of land. 91% of residentially zoned land in Connecticut is zoned for single family housing. That's the purple you see down on the image on the left. Most of Connecticut, we think of this kind of suburban idyllic, and that has been a very conscious level decision across generations and decades to make it possible to build one type of housing virtually everywhere in the state. We contrast that where only 2% of residentially zoned land in Connecticut allows multifamily housing, and in this context, 4-unit housing or above. And that's, of course, concentrated in our urban centers. And even in many of those areas, there's very small concentration of that. So, put those pieces together across 169 cities and towns, and that is largely why housing is so expensive. It's scarce, and frankly, it's not in the places where we need it to be from an environmental standpoint, an economic standpoint, and a racial standpoint. Having this car-centric 20th century sprawl-based land use pattern has raised the cost of everything else in our state. Obviously, transportation costs, infrastructure costs, pollution costs. That is a mentality that has really put Connecticut far behind, not just in the housing crisis, but in every other issue we're facing. So a lot of our work is trying to illustrate this problem, certainly to activate folks locally to make changes locally, which is the fastest and easy way to do things, but also for people in Connecticut, even aligned with us, to think about this role the state needs to play to get this map a little bit more rational and based on where we know folks want to live, where jobs are, where services are, and changing that map is a big project that'll take a long time. We want to talk a little bit today just about our proposal, Work, Live, Ride. I won't go too much into some of the in the weeds stuff about the legislative session last year, but for those folks that follow us, of course, a concept that we talk quite a bit about is transit-oriented communities, sometimes known as transit-oriented development. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's building more homes, more kinds of homes within walking distance of a public transit station. And we introduced a bill last year based on a Massachusetts bill that passed the year before this to encourage just around our train stations and the rapid bus stations a sort of 15 homes per acre within a 10-minute walk, natural density bonus for allowing homes of a variety of types. Some of the quick lessons learned that really informed how we came to Work, Live, Ride. Mandates across the state are really hard politically. I think a lot of us that are really motivated by seeing some of these barriers break down, particularly in Fairfield County, certainly not exclusively there, really want to drive the narrative forward and push for big change. And we just run into a lot of resistance, and we'll break that down over time. But we kind of think actually starting at the state level with a mandate is kind of a difficult place to start, and having a proposal that has a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, this 15 homes per acre across every station, didn't give enough nuance to the fact that some of our stations are in cities, some of them are in more rural areas, and we could do more everywhere, but we've got to kind of balance a little bit more nuance there. And Christie's talked about this, but the local capacity, just from a planning standpoint and an economic development standpoint in most of our communities, is a really significant concern. The cost of infrastructure, a lot of these communities have older infrastructure to begin with that need to be upgraded, let alone expanding infrastructure to increase the opportunity for density. And that's a real barrier. And we really need to think about that, particularly at the state level. It has more of these resources to overcome that. And finally, there's this often huge battle about local control. Anyone heard the governor talk about that? A little bit problematically, in my opinion, but what we do is advocate locally and at the state level. So we really do see local planning and zoning commissions as partners, as opportunities to educate on these issues, to get folks to think a little bit more regionally and change. So we really think of them as partners. I think the perception sometimes is, groups like ours helicopter in and say you're doing it wrong and you shouldn't have any authority to do so. We take a different approach. We want local communities to embrace the positive aspects of these changes and these reforms and think about it that way. So the perception, if not the reality, was that we don't want to have supporters at the local level, which we've done a lot to overcome. So our plan for 2023, very quickly, and I'll make sure to have some time for questions. We are doing our official launch on Friday, so we'll have stuff on the website. We'll have stuff to send out to everybody. So I apologize that that's not available now, but I'll give a quick download. We've talked about transit-oriented communities being our big focus. We are certainly doing that this session, but we're taking a much different approach than we have, which we think has gotten really good feedback from a lot of the stakeholders that we want on our side, from our coalition, from folks in the state side, the agency side. So we have a pretty good sense that we can get this passed this year. And work, live, ride as a framework is really three things. First, it is a policy framework. It's a bill. We're introducing it, and we'll have the sausage making process this session. But more than that, it is a vision for a very different approach to 21st century Connecticut. And we think about it in terms of trying to get past this car-centric sprawl that I've talked about that's created this problem, and thinking about an alternative to that in the 21st century, taking advantage of Connecticut's legacy of infrastructure, its relatively small size and proximity to the New York and Boston economic regions. So we think of it really as a vision, as a conversation shift and pivot from our state to be more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable by centering our public transportation infrastructure around where we build our environment. And then finally, it is a call to action. We are absolutely motivated by getting folks to speak up in their own voices and their own experiences, both at the local level and at the state level. So we really hope that this is a motivating presentation to get folks on this call activated to work with us to pass Work, Live, Ride, and to educate folks in your local communities why this is a benefit. So the basic gist of the Work, Live, Ride framework, just from a very high view, rather than doing a mandate as we did last year, we're trying to incentivize local planning and development around transit-oriented community districts. And the basic idea here is, rather than having this half-mile radius around every train or bus or rapid bus station, we want to give local P&Zs and P&Ds the opportunity to say, okay, we think this is a really good idea for us. We want to create a zone of kind of reasonable size that's not totally outlined. It could be around a train station or a bus station, a bus route. So it's not specifically designed in legislation, a lot more discretion for the local community to kind of determine where this makes sense in our community to concentrate a little bit more density around a basic sense of homes per unit based on the population size of the community and the public transportation infrastructure within that community. The incentive side of this comes at the state level, where this Office of Responsible Growth that exists now in Office of Policy Management would basically be quarterbacking all these state resources that, as Christie's mentioned, are kind of scattered and making it very hard to coordinate them between agencies. It can be very hard for local planners and town offices to really coordinate this stuff. So what we're trying to do is actually empower this Office of Responsible Growth to work closely with local communities to identify these kind of three buckets of focus for this infrastructure. One is the planning and design of the actual districts, doing everything from the soil studies about septic tank or sewer or density, talking about brownfield remediation, finding out what makes sense for the district on the planning and design side. The second is the infrastructure improvements themselves, from water and sewer infrastructure to road safety to transit expansion, fixing bus stations, brownfield remediation, all the stuff that really needs to be teed up to actually get homes constructed, be it from the public or private sector. And that's the third bucket of actually trying to subsidize homes within these districts around certain affordability goals. And the way that we're kind of approaching this is sometimes, too much affordability can make it hard to pencil out. But certain 80% of AMI isn't deeply affordable, and sometimes that's the easiest way to pencil out without subsidies. So what we're trying to encourage is this 0 to 30% AMI population that Christie talked about. That might mean less overall units, but deeper affordability is something that we're trying to motivate in this district as well. All of that, as I said, would be coordinated at the state level through this Office of Responsible Growth, almost a de facto state planning, but really we're thinking about this more as planners, land use planners in this office, embedding themselves in these communities along all three of these steps to get stuff built, again, from the public or private sector. We've talked about transit-oriented communities and kind of what they are practically, but why are they so important to solving the housing crisis in Connecticut and, frankly, the 21st century development? And number one is it centers riders and pedestrians. All of us are just, devastated by the death of Rep. Q, and that was in a car accident, of course, but it really, unfortunately, signifies how dangerous our roads are. We know that pedestrian deaths, vehicular deaths are going up in the state. And the only way to do that is get people out of cars and make it possible for people to get out of cars, and centering pedestrians, getting our roads, particularly in downtowns and village centers, oriented more to people and pedestrians and riders than cars. The second thing is that it offers a diversity of homes and jobs. Just the nature of density allows for smaller homes, different types of ownership models. Folks at different age groups and different points in their life need different kinds of housing choices. And TODs, by their nature, with the density that we're talking about, allow for this kind of diversity. It also allows for mixed use and a concentration of jobs and services that, maybe you needed a car to get to otherwise. So it creates, finally, these exciting and sustainable places. The most beloved places in Connecticut kind of already are TOCs, as I'll talk about. So we know that they generate economic activity. People like spending time in places like these. We also know they're sustainable by getting our infrastructure away from the car-centric mentality, and lower emissions, lower vehicular miles traveled will make our immediate population or our pollution go down, and certainly protect our open spaces, because development is going to happen in Connecticut. And something we talk about quite a bit is if it's not happening around train stations, around density, it's going to go further out in a farther drive, in a green field, in a forest, and farmland that we want to preserve and protect for any number of reasons. So that's the binary choice that we really do face. So we think transit-oriented communities are a win-win-win, and are certainly part of the solution. As I've kind of alluded to,
I just want to interrupt for 1 second.
Sure.
I'm
sorry, we're already over.
No, that's right. We're at the hour, and I just want to acknowledge that I know some people will have to leave, but we can continue on for those that have the additional time to kind of hear the rest of Pete's presentation.
Yeah, I apologize for going a little long.
No, that's right. Go ahead, Pete.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I had like 5 minutes left, so I can just kind of run through it very quickly. Oops, sorry. Oops. But as I was talking about, oftentimes we hear this conversation of protecting New England character, and really New England character is transit oriented. As I said, our most successful and beloved neighborhoods and cities and towns are by definition transit oriented, whether it's a river, a canal, or a train. So, New England character is not a sprawl strip mall and cul-de-sacs. It's communities like this. So we think getting this old idea revised is actually a very good thing. Oftentimes people talk about our transit not being good enough. Well, actually 2/3 of Connecticut towns and cities have at least a bus route or rapid bus or rail. That's 40 million annual rail rides, 42 million annual bus rides. There's a significant constituency of folks that rely on the public transportation system now. We think the way to improve this and expand this is building more homes near these systems to give more riders and more constituency for it. And we already have that infrastructure in place to support that. I won't go too into much just about the details of the proposal. I'll just say, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to have the nuance of certain towns have train stations, certain towns have bus lines. Recognizing all of that, we have kind of different density requirements at different population levels. And, in some cases, cities will already go past this, which we want to incentivize more for. In other cases, towns might feel, we just have a bus line and 15 homes per acre might be a lot, but we're doing an education outreach to really make it a positive upside that we think every community of these 111 communities, there are parts of these communities that can absolutely balance and sustain this kind of density, and the economic upside of it, the environmental upside of it are so ubiquitous. We think this has a lot of opportunity to sell. So the process, as I said, is an opt-in. Community can basically say we have a TOD district already and start getting funding from the state, or we want to do this. We're just not sure how from the capacity level. Office of Responsible Growth will do so. As I've already talked about, we're not trying to outline too many specifics at the local level. We're really trying to have this being a local driven process, leveraging expertise from the state level and resources, but giving the ability to have a certain density level of as of right development of mixed use, mixed income housing developments in certain pockets of communities that the communities themselves select. We did have some sticks. If you have a train station and you don't want to build more homes around a train station, fine, the state's not going to force you in this bill. But we don't think you should get discretionary grant funding to beautify the main street. If you want to do that, you should pay for it yourself. We really have to coordinate our state expertise, our state funding, and resources around where we know growth is responsible, where we know it should be encouraged, and where that diversity of housing options are going to have the most impact for populations that need it. So that's a little bit on the stick side, but we really do emphasize it's more of a carrot approach to encourage local development. Talked about Office of Responsible Growth already. So basically, I'll just kind of close by the session just started. We're launching this officially on Friday. We have a rally coming up that if folks on our newsletter should get a link for that. If you're interested, I'm happy to stay on and answer some questions about that. But we're really excited about this approach. It's not going to solve every problem that Christie had talked about, and we know that. We're working with other partners on other housing bills to make sure that the state really prioritizes housing. We've been very encouraged, for the most part, by leadership at the state level, recognizing finally that this is the absolute existential crisis that Connecticut has to solve, and we want to be part of that solution, and we're looking forward to. So encourage everyone to follow up with us and get involved. We need all your voices, particularly folks in your part of the state, to step up and really be excited about this and see why this is going to benefit communities across the state. All right, thank you. And sorry for running a little bit long. I don't know how many folks were able to stay on.
A good number. So I would say if people have questions for Pete, please, just raise your hand at this point, or if you want to put it into the chat line. I see Dorothy has a question.
Yeah, Pete, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Is something separate happening on 830G? So yeah, that's a can of worms, obviously.
Thanks, Dorothy.
So, the short answer is, I think there's always noise to change 830G, and I think there are good faith actors that want to tweak some of the limitations of it or some of the things that maybe don't work well. And then there's some bad faith actors that say that and just kind of want to replace it. So that's always a delicate balance of, if you allow for that space, are the good faith actors going to get something that's better that folks are excited about, or is it going to just kind of lose control of that? So I think we typically defer a lot to the folks that have built 830G to say that the politics really have to be in a place where we trust that process can be productive. So that's a long answer to say, no, work-live right is not replacing 830G. It's not impacting 830G. Very different proposals and very different conversations. We will certainly participate in those conversations as they come, but we are very much envisioning this, talking to legislators, as separate things with separate constituencies and detractors and different focuses. So this won't be, oh, if we do 830G, we can get rid of, or we do work live right, we'll get rid of 830G. It's just not the conversation.
I think it's really important too, Dorothy, that I think there's this misconception that 830G is the state's housing policy. It's just a builder's remedy, right? It's completely, it's a tiny little portion of the statute, right? And it's been completely, its impact has been completely blown out of proportion. So I do like Live Work Ride is an amazing, holistic, incredible piece of legislation. 830G is just a tiny part of the statute that is a builder's remedy. And I always caution people not to conflate 830G with housing policy.
So I want to kind of respect everyone's time. So I want to give a huge thank you to Christie and Pete. Such an interesting presentation. And some people have asked, we have the recordings of these on our website, and also we'll be sending out kind of slides to people, so you'll have access to the presentation material. And also I encourage you to reach out directly to Christie and to Pete if you're interested in these issues. I also would just kind of give a quick plug. We're Social Venture Partners Connecticut, and anybody can become a member of SVP. You can go to our website. In order to do that, you can leave a comment in the chat line or communicate directly to me. I'm Mark at svp-ct.org. But just really excited about this discussion today. So want to thank our speakers, and also just thank you for the tremendous work you're doing. on these really important issues. So,
Thank you.
and as you pointed out, Christie, these totally link between, workforce and, and Pete said this too, workforce and housing and education and so on. And we see those links pretty strongly, and that's why we'll continue to work together as Christie and I have been doing over the
Yes.
past year on this.
Good.
So
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
here.